Is this truly the end of our house's legacy, Hadrian? A refusal whispered in the dark. Hadrian stood by the great hearth, his shadow stretching long and jagged against the stone. It is the only way you survive, Viven. The North does not forgive, and I am the North. You confuse protection with imprisonment, she replied, her voice steady despite the frost creeping up the hall's walls. She didn't weep. She didn't plead. She simply smoothed her velvet gown, turned her back, and walked toward the iron-bound doors. The moment her hand touched the latch, the candles in the hall erupted. The floor groaned, not from rot, but from the raw tectonic fury of the Alpha King. Outside, the pack howled, their voices drowned by the sudden, unnatural gale. She was gone. The storm had begun. The great hall of Cael Morath was a fortress carved from the bones of a mountain, and tonight it felt like a tomb. Silence usually reigned here, but it was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that precedes an avalanche. Hadrian, the Alpha King, stood motionless, his knuckles white as he gripped the mantle of the fireplace. His eyes, usually a piercing glacial blue, were currently clouded by a dark, roiling mist. He was a man built of iron and spite, a warrior who had united the fractured clans of the northern expanse under the banner of the storm. But tonight, his crown felt heavy enough to crush his skull. Viven had not looked back. That was the problem. If she had screamed, if she had thrown the goblet of wine at his head, if she had begged for his reasons, he could have handled it. He could have played the villain, pushed her away with the cold indifference that had kept him safe for 3 decades. But her silence, that elegant, detached acceptance, cut deeper than any assassin's blade. "My king," a voice emerged from the shadows. Caelan, his most trusted lieutenant, stepped into the firelight. He kept his head bowed, wise enough not to meet his alpha's gaze. "The men are restless, the pack, they sense your agitation, the barracks are trembling." Hadrian finally moved, a sharp, violent motion that sent a tremor through the floorboards. "Let them tremble," he growled. The sound wasn't quite human. It carried the resonance of grinding tectonic plates. "And get out." Caelan didn't argue. He vanished back into the gloom, knowing that when the Alpha King's rage manifested as a literal disturbance in the environment, it was best to be elsewhere. Hadrian walked to the balcony, pushing open the heavy doors. The air outside was biting, a swirling vortex of snow and ice that shouldn't have been there. It was midsummer. The harvest should have been in the fields, but the north reflected its alpha, and Hadrian's heart was currently a blizzard. He thought of Viven. She was not a commoner, nor was she a weakling. She was the heiress of the southern reach, a woman who carried the sun in her smile and gold in her veins. When she had arrived at Cael Morath, dressed in furs of white fox and silks the color of dawn, she had been a jarring, beautiful contrast to his dark, brutal world. He had tried to drive her away. He had been cruel. He had spoken of his duties, of the curse that ran through the royal line, of the inevitability of his demise. He had told her that the Alpha King could not have a queen, for a queen was a target, and he could not bear the weight of her blood on his hands. And she had looked at him, her eyes steady, her posture regal, and simply nodded. She accepted the rejection. Hadrian slammed his fist against the stone railing. The mountain groaned in sympathy. A cascade of snow tumbled from the heights, burying the stables below. He was terrified. Not of the war, not of the rival clans, not of the encroaching darkness from the eastern wastes. He was terrified of the void she had just left in his life. He had spent his entire reign building walls, convinced that solitude was the only shield for his people. Viven had been the first person to walk right up to those walls, knock, and when he refused to open the gate, she had simply turned and walked away. She hadn't fought for him. That was the twist that haunted him. Why hadn't she fought? Down in the courtyard, the pack was beginning to settle, but the low-frequency vibration of his anger still hung in the air. Hadrian watched the lights of her carriage as it wound its way down the narrow, treacherous mountain path. She was heading back to the Reach, back to a world that was warm, green, and vibrant. A world he could never step foot in without turning it to ice. He needed to focus, He needed to be the alpha. But as he watched the carriage disappear into the pines, he realized the terrifying truth. The rejection hadn't just shaken the pack. It had shaken the very foundation of his purpose. If she didn't care enough to stay, what was he ruling for? The rejection isn't just about romance. It's about control. Hadrian thinks he controls everything, including the weather and his people. Vivian's calm departure is the first thing he hasn't been able to force into a specific reaction. This power dynamic will be the engine of the story. I am aiming for a Gothic medieval aesthetic. Think sharp edges, cold stone, and emotional suppression. The prose is designed to be lean, reflecting Hadrian's own personality. The Council of the Iron Fangs met not in the Great Hall, but in the War Room, a chamber carved into the deepest, coldest root of the mountain. Here, the air did not smell of hearth fire. It smelled of flint, iron, and the metallic tang of impending blood. Hadrian sat at the head of the obsidian table, his fingers tracing a deep gouge in the stone. Outside, the blizzard howled, an unnatural, sentient thing that screamed against the mountain's flanks. Inside, the lieutenants and elders sat in a terrified silence, their breaths misting in the frigid air. They weren't just reporting on territory disputes or supply lines, they were reporting on the king himself. "The border watch is failing, my king," Vargas, the eldest of the lieutenants, began. He was a man scarred by 100 battles, his voice rasping like sandpaper on wood. He didn't look at Hadrian. Nobody did. They looked at the frost that was rapidly spreading across the map laid out before them. "The men say the snow is unnatural. They say it is blocking the southern passes. They say the king's heart is choking the land." Hadrian lifted his gaze. His eyes were no longer just blue. They were swirling, dark vortices of silver and ice. "The land reflects the king, Vargas. You know the law. If the king is weak, the land dies." "You are not weak," one of the younger wolves, a hot-blooded warlord named Thorn, snapped. He slammed his fist down, rattling the heavy goblets. "But you are distracted. The southern girl, Viven, has departed. Yet, the ice has not receded. The frost is thickest near the main gate, where she left. It is as if you are holding the mountain closed behind her." Hadrian felt a surge of rage, and the room instantly plummeted in temperature. Ice crackled, spiderwebbing across the stone walls with a sharp report of pistol fire. Thorn stumbled back, his cloak instantly stiff with rime. "Careful, Thorn," Hadrian whispered, his voice vibrating with an inhuman resonance. "Do not speak of what you do not understand." "I understand survival," Thorn retorted, though he was shaking now, his breath ragged. "We made an oath to the north, not to a southern socialite. The Iron Oath binds us to the blizzard, to the cold, to the silence. But you act as if you want to break it, the Iron Oath." The phrase hit Hadrian like a physical blow. He hadn't asked for this crown. He hadn't asked to be the vessel for the northern winter, to be the living anchor for the storm that kept the eastern wastes at bay. He had been born to it, a child of the frost blood, destined to sacrifice his own humanity to keep the world from burning. For 3 decades, he had lived by the code. No kin, no queen, no mercy. And then, Viven had appeared. He remembered the first time he saw her. She had been dancing in the solstice gardens, her dress a spill of sunlight against the gray stone. She hadn't seen him watching. She had looked at the snow, not with fear, but with curiosity. She had reached out a hand, and the frost had swirled around her fingertips, not harming her, but welcoming her. He had convinced himself it was a fluke. He had told himself she was a target, that his enemies would use her to poison his heart. But deep down, he knew the truth he had hidden even from his own shadow. He hadn't rejected her because she was a target. He had rejected her because he was afraid that if she stayed, he would finally feel something other than cold. And if he felt, the storm would break. "The oath is not a prison," Hadrian said, his voice cold and flat. "It is a necessity." "Then show us," Vargas growled, leaning forward. "Command the storm to cease. If you are still the Alpha, command the sky to clear. Prove to the pack that the girl is gone and her memory has no hold on you." Hadrian looked at the map. The blizzard was centered directly over the pass she was traveling through. It wasn't him holding her back. It was the mountain. He realized with a terrifying clarity that the mountain was not obeying him. The north wasn't following his command anymore. It was reacting to his desire. The blizzard was trying to keep her here, to force her to return to his gates. He was the Alpha, the master of the storm. Yet the storm was acting on its own agenda. "The weather will turn when it is ready," Hadrian said, standing up. His chair shattered into splinters behind him. "And not a moment before. We move to the eastern front. The wastes are stirring, and if you think the snow is your biggest threat, you are fools." He turned and walked out, his stride long and purposeful. He left the council room in silence, the temperature rising by a fraction, yet the air remained thick with tension. As he walked the corridors of Cael Morath, he heard the whispers of the guards. They were scared. They were whispering about a king who was losing his grip, about a queen who never was, and about the storm that wouldn't die. He stopped before a window, looking out into the white abyss. He needed to know if she was safe. He reached out with his senses, feeling for the faint, warm spark of her presence against the backdrop of the icy world. He found her. She was miles away, her carriage stalled in a drift. And she wasn't crying. She was sitting in the dark, her hands clasped, a single candle burning in the coach. She was waiting. The Iron Oath is introduced as a piece of backstory lore that explains why he can't be with her, rather than just because he's moody. It frames his rejection as a perceived necessity for the kingdom's survival. The twist, that the storm is acting on its own to keep her near, is intended to add a layer of supernatural mystery. Is the North sentient? Does it want Viven? The pacing here is meant to be claustrophobic. By keeping the scene in the cramped, cold war room, we mirror Hadrian's internal state. The shift from the council room to the final moment looking out at her carriage is meant to contrast the harshness of his duty with the quiet reality of his longing. Hadrian did not take a battalion. He took only his stallion, a beast of iron-gray coat and obsidian hooves that cared nothing for the freezing gale. The gates of Cael Morath groaned as they were hauled open, protesting the departure of their king. But Hadrian did not glance back. He rode into the white void, the storm screaming around him, tearing at his cloak as if to warn him off. It was not a blizzard, it was a barricade. Every step his horse took through the deepening snow felt like wading through mortar. The cold was a living thing here, clawing at his armor, trying to freeze the joints of his greaves. Hadrian felt the pulse of the mountain beneath him, a low, tectonic hum that vibrated up his spine. The mountain was angry. It wanted the girl gone, yet it wouldn't let her leave. It was a contradiction that burned in Hadrian's chest, matching the unnatural heat of his own rage. He remembered his father's words, spoken before the old king had succumbed to the rot of the frostblood. "The North is a mirror, Hadrian. Do not let it see your desires, for it will manifest them as monsters." He hadn't understood then. He thought his father was speaking in metaphors of war. Now, as the ice shards stung his cheeks and the wind howled a name, Viven, he understood exactly what he had unleashed. He rode for hours, the world reduced to a blur of white and gray. His senses, honed by years of surviving the eastern wastes, cut through the whiteout. He tracked not her scent, for the wind stole it, but her heat. It was a tiny, flickering flame in the vast, dead expanse of his realm. He found the carriage in a ravine, half buried in a drift that looked carved by intent rather than nature. The horses were dead, frozen where they stood, their bodies sculpted into statues of terror. But the carriage remained upright, an elegant island of mahogany and gold amidst the savage white. Hadrian dismounted. His boots crunched on ice that shimmered with an eerie, violet hue. He approached the door, his heart hammering against his ribs, a sensation he had not felt since he was a boy. He placed his hand on the handle. The wood was warm, impossible. He pulled the door open. Viven sat inside, wrapped in a mantle of velvet and fox fur. She was not shivering. She was reading a book by the light of a single, magically preserved candle. When she looked up, her eyes were not fearful. They were sharp, assessing, and entirely too calm. I expected you sooner, she said, her voice steady, cutting through the howling wind outside. Hadrian froze, the storm swirling in the doorway behind him like a tethered wolf. You expected me. The air has been screaming your name for 3 miles, Viven replied, closing her book with a soft thud. She looked at the snow banked against the windows, then back to his storm-gray eyes. And the mountain has been trying to bury me. I assume you're the reason for both. Hadrian stepped into the carriage, the temperature inside instantly dropping, his frost-rimed armor clinking as he moved. He crouched, filling the small space with his looming, lethal presence. You should have kept moving. You should have been across the border by now. I could not, she said, finally letting a flicker of emotion cross her face. Not fear, but frustration. The snow moved to block me. It grew like a wall, higher every time the horses tried to turn back. I am a prisoner, Hadrian, and I believe you are the jailer. I am no jailer, he growled, reaching out to grasp her chin. His touch left a smear of frost on her skin, but she didn't flinch. I am the one trying to keep you safe from a world that wants to swallow you whole. Why are you waiting? Why didn't you turn back when you realized the storm was unnatural? Because, Viven said, leaning into his touch, her gaze locking onto his with terrifying intent. I wanted to see if you would let me die. The wind outside shrieked, a sound of agony, as the realization struck him. She wasn't just a lady of the court. She was testing the strength of his humanity. In this chapter, we see Viven's strength. She isn't a damsel in distress. She is observant and calculating. By having her wait in the carriage, she flips the dynamic. She is the one in control, forcing Hadrian to come to her. Hadrian is beginning to realize that his curse isn't just about his own control. It's about his subconscious influence on the environment. The stalled carriage scene serves as the catalyst for their reunion. The reveal that the storm is a manifestation of his desires, as warned by his father, is the central conflict. Hadrian is starting to understand that he is trapped, not by his duty, but by his own suppressed emotions. The claustrophobia of the carriage is meant to contrast with the vastness of the mountain. By bringing the storm into the intimate space of the carriage, I wanted to emphasize that the emotional turmoil is now unavoidable. He can no longer hide from her or his own heart. The air inside the carriage was not merely cold, it was charged, humming with the static electricity of a brewing cyclone. Hadrian remained hunched, his massive frame seemingly crushing the space, yet he was painfully aware of Viven's stillness. She sat opposite him, her hands folded in her lap, her posture perfect, as if she were receiving guests in her father's solar rather than shivering in a death trap on a mountainside. You speak as if the mountain is a sentient beast, Hadrian said, his voice a low rumble that made the velvet upholstery vibrate. He did not sit. To sit would be to surrender to the intimacy of the space. It is weather, Viven. Cruel, yes. Unpredictable, yes. But it is not a creature with motives. Viven tilted her head, the single candle casting flickering shadows that played across her sharp cheekbones. You are the king of the north, Hadrian. Do not lie to me, and do not lie to yourself. You felt it when you entered. You felt the intent. He looked away, staring at the frosted glass of the carriage window. Outside, the world was a chaotic swirl of white, a relentless assault of ice that threatened to crush the mahogany shell they occupied. He had felt it. The way the snow didn't just drift. It sought, it probed, it clung to the carriage like a lover refusing to let go. Even if it were, Hadrian conceded, his jaw tight. What do you hope to gain by waiting? The roads are impassable. The pack will come looking for me. They will see you as the cause of this delay, and they will not be kind. Let them come, she said softly. The simplicity of her defiance struck him harder than a mace. He turned back to her, his storm-gray eyes darkening. You are arrogant, or perhaps you are simply tired of living. Do you have any idea what the Iron Oath demands of those who violate the silence? I know the oath, she replied, her voice gaining a steely edge. I know it demands blood, silence, and the eternal winter. I know it forbids the king from knowing the warmth of a woman who is not of the snows. But tell me, Hadrian, does the oath forbid you from knowing the truth? He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Truth is a luxury for men who don't have to hold a kingdom together. Is that what you are doing? Vivian stood up. The carriage swayed, the wood groaning under the force of the gale outside. She was not a tall woman, but in the small space, she seemed to command the room. She stepped closer to him, closing the gap until he could smell the faint, impossible scent of lilies amidst the ozone and frost. You are not holding the kingdom together. You are burying it alive, hoping that if you hide the world under enough snow, you won't have to face what you've lost. He reached out, his instinct to protect or to intimidate taking over. He caught her by the shoulders, his grip firm. He expected her to flinch, to recoil from the supernatural cold that always radiated from his skin. Instead, she leaned into him. The heat of her body was a shock. It was as if he had plunged his hand into a forge. Where his fingers touched her velvet cloak, the frost that usually clung to his armor sizzled and vanished. It wasn't just heat. It was presence. It was the feeling of life asserting itself against the void. Hadrian gasped, his grip loosening, but he didn't pull away. The carriage lurched violently, hit by a sudden gust that sounded like a giant tearing the fabric of reality. Outside, the mountain roared in anger. "The storm," he whispered, his eyes wide as he looked at her. "It's not keeping you here. It's reacting to us. It reacts because it is a mirror," Vivian murmured, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, right over his heart. The silver embroidery of her dress caught the candlelight, shimmering like starlight. "You spent 30 years pushing everything away, building a wall of ice around your soul. But the north is not just ice, Hadrian. It is also the deep, quiet fire beneath the earth. It is the sleeping strength." "I am the king," he stammered, his internal resolve fracturing. "I have no strength but the storm." "Then let the storm break," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the thunder outside. "Let it shatter. You think the oath defines you? You are a man, not a monolith. You are allowed to breathe." He looked down at her, and for the first time in his adult life, the ice in his vision cleared. He didn't see a target. He didn't see a complication. He saw a mirror, reflecting a part of himself he had murdered decades ago. The carriage groaned, the roof bowing under the weight of the encroaching drift. They were trapped, miles from the gates, isolated in the heart of the most dangerous storm in a century, with nothing but the thin walls of a wooden coach between them and oblivion. "If I stay," Hadrian said, his voice trembling with a vulnerability he hadn't known he possessed, "you will never leave this mountain. You know that, don't you? The storm, it will take you if you refuse to go." "Then?" Vivian replied, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "I suppose you will have to learn how to change the weather." The stalled carriage scene serves as a crucible. It's a classic literary device to strip away external pretenses. The dialogue about the deep, quiet fire beneath the earth hints at a latent, perhaps forgotten aspect of Hadrian's heritage. The storm reacting to their connection is a visual metaphor for their entanglement. Their bond is literally altering the reality of the north. The contrast between cold ice, Hadrian, and heat lilies, Vivian, is intentional, focusing on sensory details. The movement from the chaotic exterior to the tense, whispered intimacy of the interior is meant to create a pressure cooker effect. The chapter ends on a cliffhanger. He has accepted the challenge of changing the weather, setting up the next phase of their journey. Hadrian stepped out of the carriage, his boots sinking into the waist-deep drift. The cold was instantaneous, a physical weight that pressed against his chest, but for the first time, it didn't feel like him. It felt alien. The wind screamed, a cacophony of frozen rage, but as he stood in the heart of the gale, he didn't raise his hand to command it. He didn't pull the shadows of the storm around him like a cloak. Instead, he closed his eyes and breathed. A simple, human act he had treated as a weakness for decades. He thought of the lilies Vivian smelled of. He thought of the way her hands had felt against his chest, not a burn, but a reclamation. "You are a man, not a monolith." The storm lashed at him, driving ice shards into his skin, testing his resolve. It wanted the old Hadrian, the king who built walls of ice to keep the world away. But he refused to be that man. He reached deep inside, past the layers of duty, past the suffocating weight of the iron oath, and found the ember Viven had spoken of. It was small, a fragile thing he had buried in the dark. But it was there. He exhaled, and the air around him shivered. It wasn't a roar of power. It was a sigh. The air turned, the static charge of the blizzard flickering and dying. The violet hues of the ice began to fade, replaced by the stark, honest white of a natural winter. The wind, which had been a barrier of teeth and claws, dropped to a gentle, morning breeze. Hadrian opened his eyes. The clouds were fracturing. Above, the sky was a bruised purple, but for the first time since Vivien's departure, the stars were visible, sharp, cold, and indifferent, but no longer hostile. He turned back to the carriage. The wood was no longer groaning. The frost that had coated the mahogany had vanished, replaced by beads of water that clung to the varnish like tears. He pulled the door open. Viven sat exactly where he had left her, though she had moved the candle to the small table. She looked up, her expression unreadable, though her eyes searched his. "The storm is gone," she said, more a question than a statement. "It is moving on," Hadrian replied, his voice raspy. He climbed back inside, sitting heavily. He didn't have his usual, looming aura of command. He felt strangely hollow, as if he had emptied himself of a burden he hadn't known he was carrying. "I didn't force it, I just stopped holding it." Viven reached out, brushing a stray snowflake from his shoulder. Her touch was warm, real, and utterly grounding. "You stopped fighting the world, Hadrian. That's a terrifying thing to do when you've spent a lifetime believing the world is your enemy." "If I am not the storm," Hadrian whispered, staring at his hands, "who am I? The pack expects a weapon. The border needs a monster." "You are a man who has finally decided to live," she corrected, her voice firm. "And a man who is living is far more dangerous than a man who is merely existing. A weapon has no choice. A man does." The carriage was silent then, save for the rhythmic dripping of melting snow off the roof. The silence wasn't the suffocating, heavy tension of before. It was expectant. "We cannot go back to Kael Morath," Hadrian said, the realization settling in. "Not like this. If I show up as myself, they will see it as weakness." "Then show them," Viven challenged. "Show them that true strength isn't about crushing everything that touches you. Show them that a king who can temper his own winter is a king who can lead a summer." He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the reflection she had promised. He wasn't the monolith of the north. He was the fire beneath the ice. "The road to the reach is long," he said, shifting to make room for her as the carriage wheels began to creak, the path ahead finally clear. "And we are miles from the gates. Then we have time," she smiled. And for the first time, he saw the sunlight she had brought with her. "To learn how to breathe." The conflict has shifted from man versus nature to man versus self. The external threat, the storm, barricade, is resolved, which now forces the characters to deal with the political fallout. They are no longer hiding in a carriage. They are moving toward a confrontation with the reality of his kingdom. The imagery focuses on melting, the shift from ice-solid static to water, flow, dynamic. The transition from the screaming storm to the quiet, dripping interior of the carriage is intended to create a sense of intimacy and newfound vulnerability. The journey toward the southern border was, in a literal sense, quieter than the journey out. The blizzard had ceased its relentless assault, replaced by a brooding gray stillness that blanketed the world. Yet, the air within the carriage remained thick, not with the static of a storm, but with the weight of impending scrutiny. Hadrian watched the pines blur past the frosted window. He was no longer the man who had ridden out to retrieve the southern heiress. He was a man returning to a kingdom that was waiting, with bated breath, to see if its king had been broken or reborn. "They will be waiting at the Blackwater Pass," Viven said, her voice cutting through the rhythmic clatter of the carriage wheels. She had been studying a map, her finger tracing the thin, treacherous line of the mountain road. "The Iron Fangs aren't just your advisors, Hadrian. They are the guardians of the status quo. They will see your change as a surrender." Hadrian leaned his head back against the velvet, closing his eyes. He could feel the pulse of the north, no longer a screaming, violent current, but a deep, slow heartbeat. They have spent 30 years sharpening their blades on the idea of me as a weapon. If I return as something else, they will feel dull. Then show them why the blade is sharper when it has a hand to guide it, she suggested, looking up from the map. Her eyes were bright, unafraid. The carriage shuddered, then slowed, the horses whinnying in protest. The rhythmic rolling of the wheels was replaced by the crunch of heavy boots on packed snow. Hadrian opened his eyes. He didn't reach for his sword. He didn't call the shadows to his aid. He simply smoothed the front of his coat and stood up, his massive frame nearly brushing the roof. "Stay inside," he commanded, though his tone lacked the sharp, jagged edge of his usual authority. "No," Viven replied, standing as well. "If they are coming for you, they are coming for us. I will not hide in the dark." Hadrian hesitated, then nodded. He pushed the door open. The scene outside was a tableau of winter discipline. A dozen riders, clad in the dark, fur-lined armor of the Iron Fangs, blocked the narrow pass. At their head sat Thorn, his face a map of fresh scars and suppressed fury. He held a polearm aloft, the iron tip gleaming with a dull, matte finish. "My king," Thorn barked, his voice carrying over the silence of the woods. He did not dismount, a blatant breach of protocol that made the guards around the carriage stiffen. "The council has concerns. The storm has died, the roads are open, and yet you return without the complication." Hadrian stepped out of the carriage, the cold air rushing to meet him. He moved with a grace that was new, stripped of the heavy, looming aura of forced menace. He looked at Thorn, not as a monster looks at prey, but as a king looks at a subject. "The complication is my business, Thorn," Hadrian said, his voice level. "And the storm has not died. It has been tempered. There is a difference." Thorn scoffed, his gaze flicking to the carriage door where Viven had just emerged. The soldiers shifted, their hands dropping to their hilts. The tension was a physical pressure, a tightening wire. "You've gone soft, Hadrian. The southern air has rotted your resolve. The north demands an alpha who is made of ice, not a man who bleeds." Hadrian took a step forward. He felt the familiar pull of the north, the urge to let the temperature drop until the very air shattered, until these men were on their knees, begging for warmth. The power was there, a coiled serpent waiting for the command. He breathed in. He smelled the pine, the damp earth, and the faint, sweet scent of lilies clinging to Vivian's cloak. He chose the smell of life. "I am the North," Hadrian said. And for the first time, the statement wasn't a threat of destruction, it was a promise of dominion. He didn't raise his hand to crush them. He simply looked at Thorn, his eyes steady, unclouded by the silver haze of the blizzard. "And the North is not just the avalanche that destroys, it is the spring that endures. I have spent decades being the winter that kills. I am done being a casualty of my own duty." Thorn's expression wavered. He had expected a roar, a surge of power, a display of lethal force. He had not expected calm. "You are abdicating," Thorn hissed. "I am reigning," Hadrian corrected. He looked at the other riders. "I am going to the Reach to ensure the survival of our borders. If you seek a king who destroys everything he touches, then you are following the wrong man. If you seek a king who can lead us through the thawing world, then turn your horses around." The silence stretched, agonizing and long. Thorn gripped his polearm, his knuckles white. The men looked from their commander to the king, and then to the woman standing beside him, her presence as steady as a mountain peak. Slowly Thorn exhaled, the mist of his breath rising into the cold air. He looked at Hadrian, really looked at him, and saw not the weapon, but the man who had held the North together for 30 years. And perhaps, for the first time, he saw the man's strength. Thorn lowered his polearm. He didn't bow, but he nodded. "The path to the Reach is treacherous, my king. You will need an escort." "We will take it," Hadrian replied, his voice firm, as the Iron Fangs turned their mounts, falling into formation behind the carriage. Hadrian felt a profound, exhausting relief. He hadn't fought the world. He had invited it to fall in line. He turned back to Viven. She was smiling, a small, knowing expression that mirrored the light beginning to break through the clouds above.
"You did it,"
she whispered, stepping closer. "I didn't do anything," Hadrian replied, his voice thick with a new, strange emotion. "I just stopped fighting." The Iron Fangs represent the traditionalist view of the kingdom. They are the secondary antagonist, not because they are evil, but because they are stuck in the past. Having them join the escort is a turning point. It legitimizes Hadrian's new path, even if they don't fully understand it yet. The transition from the screaming storm of previous chapters to the quiet confrontation in this chapter is intended to show growth. The imagery of the spring that endures serves as the thematic anchor. Hadrian is moving from a force of destruction to a force of stability. The transition from the high, unforgiving peaks to the rolling foothills of the borderlands was deceptive. The air remained thin and sharp, but the white expanse had given way to fields of gray, brittle grass and stone-choked rivers. The carriage now trailed a string of riders, the Iron Fangs, their armor dark and silent, keeping pace with the steady rhythm of the wheels. Hadrian sat in the silence of the coach, staring at the map Viven had laid out. He felt a phantom ache in his chest, a residual cold that pulsed in time with the mountain's heartbeat. Even from this distance, he had left the high pass, but the north followed him. It lived in his skin, in his eyes, in the very way the wind seemed to bow around the carriage as they moved. "We are approaching Hollowhearth," Viven said, her voice soft but alert. She didn't look up from her own notes, but her posture had stiffened. "It's a border trading hub. My father's merchants used to pass through here to reach the northern markets." Hadrian stiffened. "I remember the reports. It was a site of strategic resistance, months ago." "Resistance?" Vivian's eyes snapped to his, cold and unblinking. "Is that what you call a town refusing to freeze to death?" The carriage lurched as the driver pulled the horses to a halt. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of the Iron Fang's mounts ceased, replaced by a tense, heavy stillness. Hadrian pushed the door open, stepping out into the biting wind. The sight before him was not a village of life, but a graveyard of industry. The river that usually powered the town's watermills was blocked, choked by a massive, unnatural ice dam. The water had flooded the lower streets, and the subsequent freeze had turned the town into a sculpture of misery. Houses were encased in rime, their roofs bowed under the weight of an eternal winter that should have melted by now. Thorn rode up, his face grim. "This is the blockade, my king. We established it during the skirmishes. It was meant to starve the southern sympathizers out. It seems it was too effective." Hadrian walked toward the riverbank, his boots crunching on the frozen slush. He could feel it now, the residual static of his own command. He had ordered this blockade from his throne room, hundreds of miles away, in a fit of rage after a border dispute. He hadn't thought of the people. He had thought only of the message. "They are dying," Viven said, appearing at his side. She was wrapped in her furs, but she looked frail against the sheer scale of the devastation. "The people who lived here, they aren't soldiers, Hadrian. They are families." "I did not know," Hadrian started, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. "I did not care." That was the truth, and it stared back at him from every frosted window and every empty hearth. Thorn dismounted, his heavy boots clanking. "The council advised against leaving this as a permanent fixture, but you were distracted at the time, sire. We left it to ensure no supplies reached the reach." Hadrian looked at the dam. It was a monolith of his own making, a jagged wall of ice that defied the natural thaw. It was a reflection of his own closed heart. He could hear the faint, desperate sounds of life within the village. A cough, the creak of a door, the low cry of a child. "Dismantle it," Hadrian commanded, his voice tight. Thorn hesitated. "Sire, the structure is frozen into the bedrock. It would take a team of engineers weeks to break it with picks and fire. It's too thick." "I said dismantle it," Hadrian repeated, his gaze locking onto the ice. He walked to the center of the bridge, ignoring the protest of his own body. He had spent his life using his power to solidify, to trap, to hold. He had to learn to do the opposite. He had to learn how to let go. He placed his hands against the surface of the frozen dam. It was freezing, a biting cold that clawed at his bones. But he didn't pull away. He closed his eyes, searching for the fire Viven had spoken of, the latent heat beneath the ice, the rhythm of the water that still wanted to flow. It was an agonizing process. He had to reverse the polarity of his own soul. He had to reach into the heart of the ice and convince it that it was water. The air around him began to distort. The Iron Fangs backed away, their horses skittish, sensing the raw, uncontrolled fluctuation of the king's power. Hadrian gritted his teeth, sweat freezing on his brow. The dam groaned, a sound like a cathedral collapsing. "Hadrian, stop!" Viven cried out, though her hand stayed on his arm, anchoring him. "You'll break yourself." "I have to fix it," he grunted, the veins in his neck bulging. He pushed, not with force, but with intention. He remembered the feeling of the spring thaw, not the destruction of the ice, but its transformation. With a sudden, violent crack that echoed across the valley, the dam split. It didn't shatter, it fractured, fissures webbing across the surface until, with a roar, the water burst free. The surge of the river tore through the opening, a torrent of life reclaiming its path. Hadrian collapsed, his legs giving out. He fell onto the wooden planks of the bridge, gasping for breath. The sudden absence of the cold was a shock. He felt warmer, lighter, and utterly exhausted. He looked up to see the villagers emerging from their homes, staring in disbelief as the water finally began to clear the streets. There was no cheering. There was only the stunned silence of people who had been waiting to die. Thorn stood over him, his expression unreadable. He looked at the rushing river, then down at the king who lay in the slush. He finally did something he had never done before. Thorn bowed. "The path to the Reach is clear, my king," he said, his voice uncharacteristically respectful. Hadrian stood, with Viven's help, his hands trembling. He looked at the town, then back at his men. He realized then that he hadn't just cleared a river. He had begun to clear his own conscience. This chapter serves as the Atonement beat. It was crucial for Hadrian to confront a direct, tangible consequence of his past rule. He can no longer hide behind the excuse of duty. By forcing him to use his power to save rather than destroy, I wanted to show the physical and emotional toll of his transformation. He isn't just becoming kind, he is doing the hard, exhausting work of repairing what he broke. The conflict shifts from the internal, will he change, to the external, can he be forgiven? Thorn's bow is the pivot point here. It signals that the Iron Fangs are beginning to see the pragmatic value of a king who can lead, rather than just a weapon that kills.